We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm very excited today to have Bret Weinstein on the podcast. Bret, let's say Dr. Bret Weinstein is famous for being on Joe Rogan's podcast so many times. Now we almost have the same number of listeners as Joe Rogan. I guess in the cosmic sense of being close to the same number of listeners. So Bret, thank you so much for being on the show and taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So let me introduce you to the audience a little bit. This is going to be such a cool episode because you are outspoken and a leading thought leader, really, on a variety of subjects, to include cancel culture, to include which is so relevant to what we're dealing with now in America. You're also a theoretical evolutionary biologist and a former professor at Evergreen State College. So maybe now maybe the audience is starting to remember your story. I'm going to briefly go over it, but I really just want to ask you about that and start off with your experience at Evergreen College. Your first experience at notoriety because you were the focus of a campus protest there. This was back in March of 2017, I believe. And May. Okay. So May was the protest, but it began when you wrote a letter in March of 2017. And that letter objected to a change in the college's decades-old tradition of observing a day of absence. Now, this day of absence is a day where students and faculty of minority students and faculty would stay home from campus to highlight their contributions to the college. You're in favor of this. It's a decades-long practice. But the change would flip the traditional event, asking white students and faculty to stay home instead. And you opposed this. In late May 2017, student protests focusing on you disrupted the campus and caused for quite a few called for many changes there as well. The college's president refused to allow law enforcement to come and quell the protesters, and you were told that they could not protect you. You resigned, and ever since you've been part of something called the intellectual dark web. I haven't heard a lot about the intellectual dark web lately, so maybe we could get a refresher on that. But again, Bret, welcome. And I also want to say you describe yourself as a political progressive and left libertarian, and you've appeared somewhat recently, at least in 2018, on the House Oversight Committee to discuss free speech on college campuses. And you had some great things to say there too. So in your own words, that experience at Evergreen, what was that like? And are we now realizing that this kind of cancel culture movement, this anti-free speech movement is no longer confined to campuses?
Well, yes, I think we are all now having the experience that my wife and I somewhat uniquely had at Evergreen back in 2017. So in some sense, this is a much easier case to make now. But the fact was that the events surrounding our leaving Evergreen are much more complex than was recorded in public. So it's not even right to say that the events started around my email objecting to the change in the day of absence tradition, because actually the protests that demanded my firing erupted exactly 1 year to the day after I had raised an objection in a faculty meeting where no students were present to a change in our contracts at the college. It was the first initiative among many that would create a de facto race-based hierarchy inside of this institution where my wife and I had been teaching for 14 years in my case, 15 years in her case. So that initiative involved faculty voting to insert into our contracts an annual obligation to reflect on our own internal racism every year in a document that was public. In other words, that it belonged to the college and would be fodder for hiring and firing decisions, promotion, etc. So I objected to this because, for one thing, it simply assumed that each of us had racism within us that required our vigilance to attempt to eradicate. Which
clearly you need to read the book White Fragility, New York Times bestseller, because that's exactly the message from that book.
Oh yes, and it's it's no accident. In fact, Heather and I were not on campus when D'Angelo visited in, I believe, 2016. We were in Ecuador with students, but D'Angelo was invited and gave a talk at Evergreen about exactly this. So yes, the change in our contracts that the faculty voted for was directly following from this belief system, which is, of course, nonsense. But in any case, the college just simply began to transform itself into a very different institution, one in which we were no longer aspiring to look past differences between people, but we're focusing on these superficial differences between people obsessively. And, as a human being, as an American, as a liberal, I had no choice but to object to this. But that turned me into the enemy of the movement that was intent on making these changes.
I see. So by the time that the reversal of the day of absence policy came into being, you were already in the sights here. Do you have a name for this movement? I mean, because you're a self-described liberal, and which means you stand up for basic liberal values. Liberalism, in my opinion, and I believe yours as well, is being trampled over. I disagree with liberals on a variety of subjects, but real liberalism, I think, is a very healthy counterweight to real conservatism. It's a balance that I think we need.
I agree with that, by the way.
Yeah, no, I know you do. But what do we call leftist? I call it leftism. I'll tell you what I call it leftism. I call it postmodernism. I do attach the label progressivism to the far leftism as well. Am I getting it wrong? What should we call it so that we're all on the same page and liberals and conservatives can unite on this?
Well, I can tell you're very definitely getting it wrong, but that does not give us any hint of what we should be calling this. So okay. The reason I say you're getting it wrong is that I belong to a tradition of liberalism that simply does not recognize any of these truths that are being asserted, changes that are being demanded. These things are as foreign to me as anything I have seen politically. So I don't have the sense that the fact that I believe that we have substantial progress that we must make puts me in the same camp as folks essentially demanding that we return to a world in which the primary factor about whether you see someone as enemy or ally is whether or not you have a genetic relatedness with them. I think this is frankly, it's the uninvention of all of the best things that have occurred in the last couple thousand years.
Yeah, I mean, and we do agree that that's not liberalism. That's the opposite of liberalism, right? I mean, I would think, but I guess to your point, you're saying that liberalism has been twisted. I'm trying to collectively and have a national conversation and say, liberalism is still a good thing as long as it's this definition that we all used to agree on of open and free speech and open debate and respect for individuals as they are as individuals and not group identity politics. These appear to me to be liberal values. And I don't want the definition, because if we change the definition of liberalism, we've got nothing. Then it's just conservatives that believe those things.
Right. Well, I agree. And I must say, I'm grateful to see that things that would traditionally be values held on the left are being defended by honorable people on the right. That has been maybe the silver lining of some of what's taken place. But the problem with naming this force is that it is hell-bent on a kind of deception that makes it impossible to discuss. So let's take,
Yeah.
for example, the label Black Lives Matter. I find the label a very comfortable one. I believe Black Lives Matter. And what's more, I don't believe that all lives matter is the right answer, because
I
what
agree.
Black Lives Matter appears to mean is that Black lives are undervalued, and that's a problem that should concern all Americans, with which I also agree. But if I look at the policy proposals that are being advanced under that label, I find that they are actually not only un-American, but anti-Black. And so am I in favor of Black Lives Matter? It depends if we're talking about the sentiment, in which case I am, or the movement, in which case I'm not. Mm-hmm. And this is true if we talk about social justice warriors. Am I in favor of social justice? Of course. But what social justice warriors want looks to me like injustice. They call themselves liberals. I see them as illiberal. And so if everything is going to be labeled as its opposite, it becomes very difficult to discuss these things.
It's like anti-fascist. It's like Antifa.
Exactly.
I mean, it's
right. It's labeled so that it's unassailable, and that allows many abhorrent things to travel just beneath the radar.
These agreeable terms are being used as a vehicle for very unagreeable things, and I as a conservative, I'm used to this tactic. This takes place in many ways. Let me give you an example. Takes place in legislation naming.
Sure.
Just the CARES Act, right? If you don't vote for this, you don't care. I mean, that's that's the implication. Or
the Patriot Act.
Right. Yeah. That's a good one too. You always want to label it with this, but here's even more specific. One is Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act, And they're like, why? You can't vote against that. Well, you can, because it turns out the legislation has almost nothing to do with that particular subject. And, and they know that people won't read between the lines there. So this is a common tactic. And, obviously Antifa uses specifically fascist tactics that are to make its, to meet its ends, whatever those ends are. I mean, that's a whole other conversation. And I'm going to read a quote from you that you said in your congressional testimony in was it 2018? It just kind of applies to what you were just saying. What is occurring on college campuses is about power and control. Speech is a last resort when groups fail to self-censor in response to a threat of crippling stigma and destruction of the capacity to earn. These tools are being used to unhook the values that hold us together as a nation: equal protection under the law, presumption of innocence, free marketplace of ideas, and that people are judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. I mean, that's exactly right. Again, these are liberal values. And I think it's important to define them as liberal values because, they're shared. Let's say they're American, but these are American values.
I agree. And I actually think that this is a really important point. In some sense, I think liberalism has turned itself into a joke by embracing these illiberal ideas. But sometimes I hear conservatives, especially young conservatives, who misunderstand that liberalism was always a joke. And so to the extent that these values are ones that are American values, in some sense, it owes that to liberals, including the founders. Mm-hmm. So these values are now universal or nearly so. And the fact that not only have they become universal in the U.S., but that much of the world has recognized our example and followed it is something of which we can be quite proud. And you have no idea the horror I feel watching something that declares itself liberal attempt to uninvent these things.
It is horrible. There's some standing up to it. When I first reached out to you, I for some reason I thought I saw your name on the Harper's letter, which was it's a group of left leaning people, a pretty wide array. I mean, Noam Chomsky was on the letter, writing a letter defending free speech, taking their, of course, necessary jabs at conservatives because we're totalitarians, and again, I'll let you react to that as well. But you weren't on the letter, and when we spoke about it, you had some interesting reasoning behind the letter, and what is to become of it. So can we have that conversation again?
Yes, I must say, I detest this letter for reasons that are very different from most of the pushback that it has received. I was not invited. None of the people associated with IDW were invited. That was apparently a conscious choice. Had I been invited, I wouldn't have signed it because the text of the letter was not only extremely tepid in its defense of free expression of ideas, but it was also petty, mean-spirited, and unfair to conservatives who have been some of the few to defend us traditional liberals in recent years. So there's no way I was going to break ranks with honorable conservatives, like, for example, Robbie George, who was on the House Oversight panel with me. The letter, it starts out by effectively saying that the impulse to censor is a conservative problem, and we are beginning to see hints of it on the left, which is not true. The fact is there are many conservatives, I think you and Robbie George prominently among them, who hold this value very highly. You see it as an American value, and the left has been terrible about this of late. And so, in any case, the letter I thought was, it did a tremendous disservice to the natural coalition of people who believe in civil liberties and freedom of expression and frankly, in America. So it wasn't a letter I could have signed, but the fact that some of us were excluded from the letter, excluded from even knowing that it existed until it was in the world, which meant that we couldn't level challenges to the text at a point where they could have done some good, I find equally troubling when the letter specifically had signatories like Matt Iglesias, who had been part of the problem. Now, to Matt's credit, he has acknowledged that he got it wrong, and he now recognizes that this thing that we call cancel culture is a very dangerous phenomenon. But he arrived late after having demonized many of us who had been trying to explain this for several years. So why was Matt asked, and let's say Sam Harris excluded? Sam Harris has been on the right side of this issue from the beginning, and they should have sought his counsel, and I'm pretty sure that Sam would have told them the same thing I would have, that the letter just simply didn't make sense as it was written.
Yeah, and you got to wonder, like, what's the point then? If it's, I honestly, do you have any ideas on like what they were thinking as to what they hoped to accomplish by that? Because some people just jumped right off of it after the backlash from the left came.
Yeah, I think I know what the impulse was. I think there were people who felt that they had a deal, that effectively they were they had a protection from being canceled, and really canceled means having your ability to earn eliminated without a court or any sort of due process. So I think upon discovering that this illiberal force is capable of challenging anything that stands in its way, and that effectively nobody has an exemption, there was an attempt to renegotiate some kind of a settlement which would account for the tepidness of the letter. In other words, the letter basically surrendered a huge amount of territory to this movement. Yeah. And the idea was, if we back our claims off to a sufficient degree, will you let us remain? And anyway, that impulse, of course, is incredibly divisive. And I think we have to, everybody who reinvents that idea has to be taken aside and have the reality explained to them, which is all of us who understand the value of free speech have to defend everybody who is being stigmatized into oblivion.
I see. So it was a bit of a olive branch to the left in a way, in the hopes that we would be untouchable. This select group would be untouchable to an extent. Of course, that's impossible. And again, if they had asked your counsel or my counsel, I would have said, "Yeah, never give an inch. You can never give an inch. This operates like a cult, as you've described it. It operates like a cult, and they will always ask for more. And the end result is not clear. This is the other concerning thing about these movements, whether it's Antifa or the BLM movement. Again, different from the phrase, and I agree with you. I want to make that distinction as well.
So wait out before we move on from the Harper's letter. There's one other thing I want to say, which is, I am not saying that the signatories had this in mind. In fact, I know many of them would never have participated in such a thing. Mm-hmm. I have many friends who did sign the letter.
Right.
As far as I know,
they might have just said, "Hey, free speech. Yeah, I like that. Free speech. I'm good
for
that."
I think the idea is we'll sign anything that points in the right direction.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of that. Yeah. But that then effectively compromised many of the most important voices in this battle.
Right.
So the fact that those names show up there, I think, does a disservice to those of us who are intent on fighting this battle for this fundamentally American ideal and winning. That now many of the most important people in that realm are affiliated with this letter is a problem. And so again, I don't want to cast aspersions on all of the signatories or even all of the authors. I have the sense that this was basically somebody's pet project, and that it acquired all of these voices. And anyway, we should think carefully about how not to let this happen again.
Yeah, it seems like a small combination of some bad intent, but with a lot of misconception about how this radical leftism actually works. And I point out to people, look what happens to the companies or the figureheads that simply stand up to the mob. They get some press for one day and then it's over, right? Goya is fine. They're not coming back for you because they know they can't get past that first wall. Sticking to the free speech subject for a minute, I want to get your thoughts on big tech censorship and what we can actually do about that. And so, framing this discussion on the conservative side, at least, the issue we run into is, okay, can government do anything to inhibit free speech on a private entity such as Google or Facebook? And does that confronts our adherence to the First Amendment? But at the same time, we have this issue where we never foresaw, the founders, I think, could foresee a lot of things. I don't think they could foresee tech giants that have such control over what we see and hear and what we can say. And so while they technically don't infringe upon the law of the Constitution, they certainly infringe on the spirit of it. A culture of rights is just as important as the political protection of those rights, I think. And so what would be your advice from your end of this on dealing with these issues?
Well, let's put it this way. The founders certainly could not have imagined that the public square would exist in a private walled garden, and that effectively not only is it true that any idea, in order to have currency in the modern moment, has to be free to be discussed in those venues, but they also couldn't have foreseen the implications of the algorithms that adjust what the conversation looks like to those of us who are there and reading these things. So yes, we are in brand new territory with respect to the values that the founders were attempting to protect and the technical scenario in which those values have to be protected. In effect, we're going to have to navigate this in a new way. And, to a first approximation, I would say we have to, as the founders did, bend over backwards to make sure that we do not exclude important ideas, controversial as they may be, from that space. And that means that abhorrent ideas have to enjoy the same protection. The founders never figured out a way to protect avant-garde speech without protecting obnoxious speech, and we're going to find ourselves in that same bind. And so we should simply accept the cost of liberty, being that people will be able to say obnoxious things. And, that's not an entirely bad thing either. Frankly, it's important to be able to figure out who believes noxious, un-American things, and allowing them to say them out loud, has the benefit of us being able to spot those things and discuss their meaning. So in some sense, we are allowing the tech giants, which have perverse incentives in many different forms, to dictate what we are allowed to discuss and therefore what we are allowed to collectively think about, which couldn't possibly be more dangerous.
Yeah, it is. And, we're always looking for legal ways to deal with this. It would be much easier if the culture of rights that we hold so dear would come back to fruition. And then, and not force the government's hand on something like this, because it's a difficult problem to move through. The other question I get asked a lot, and this is closer to your, personal history, is, okay, what do you do about the college campuses? Because constituents are constantly asking me this. What are you going to do about it? And I'm like, I don't have a great answer for them. Some states have banned campus free speech zones, not because they want to ban free speech, but because, the implication is that you can only have free speech in certain zones. And that's a mislabeling of a zone. There's things like that. There's threats of removing federal funding if you don't properly enforce due process and free speech. You're a former university professor, or no, you still are. What's your Sorry.
Well, I'm a visiting fellow at the James Madison program in Princeton, but I'm not a professor any longer.
Okay. But obviously you understand universities. How would you answer that question?
Well, I would say, look, part of the problem is that we're getting to this very late. And the issue arises because long ago, as postmodernism began to get a foothold in the universities, instead of recognizing that it was a set of beliefs that was not worthy of being put on a par with other disciplines, we humored the postmodernists and actually gave them many different departments, which has given them disproportionate power within the structure of the university. But more importantly, it's given them access to a huge number of students who have now learned their lessons and moved on into the world. And so in some sense, it is quite accurate that even though the movement does not espouse postmodernist things directly, that the implications of what it does espouse are clearly postmodern. So we shouldn't have let this happen, is the first answer. And that means that to the extent we are able to figure out how to fix it, we mustn't let it happen again. Certain ideas have currency because they have the ability, for example, to predict features of the real world. The sciences deserve our respect because they are capable of telling us what we do not already know. Mm-hmm. That is not the case with things like critical theory, women's studies, any of these things. And so the process of recovering the universities, if it's even possible, is going to require us to prune them back to the disciplines that are actually real. That is not going to be a quick process, though. And it is also the case that because the ideology that we now see on the march in our streets has taken over things like schools of education, it could be a generation or more before we're able to clear the bad ideas out so that we can protect the good ideas and the freedom to express new ideas and discover whether they're true.
Yeah, perhaps incentivizing STEM through our student loan program could be an option.
I am in favor, and I told the House Oversight Committee that I was in favor of the federal government using its monetary leverage to ensure that due process exists on college campuses, because that has to be there in order for those campuses to function.
So you've also written about why individuals participate in cancel culture. You said game theory defines what is happening and individuals' choices. The energy in the system is about something real, say inequality and corruption, but the ideas that are spreading is to tear everything down and have utopia rise in its wake. So how does that work? How does game theory play into this?
Very simply, actually. There are complex implications, but the bottom rung is pretty easy to understand. People are confronted with a puzzle in which they are asked for their belief on something, and if they espouse the wrong belief, they are punished to an extraordinary degree. Mm-hmm. They can have their livelihood ruined over an accusation of, for example, racism, which, that's what happened to me. The accusation had no reality to it, but the fact that a protest could be cooked up that looked like students rising up against a racist professor was destructive of my ability to continue in my job. So you will be asked to do the bidding of the movement. If you show any skepticism, hesitation, disagreement, you will be punished at an extraordinary level.
Right.
And this incentivizes people to take the first step into joining ranks. And usually the first step is very small, right? Simply saying that you stand for anti-racism shouldn't be hard for anybody until you discover that anti-racism isn't what the words seem to imply. It's actually an ideology that puts race first. So if you're somebody who believes we should be eliminating the implications of race from society so that we all have equal access to opportunity, for example, and you're asked if you are willing to be an anti-racist, either you know what that means, in which case you'll probably say no and you will be declared a racist, or you don't know what that means and you'll say yes, and then later on you'll be told what you signed up for. So the ability of the individual to protect themselves in the short term causes many people to join up without realizing what they're signing on to. And once they've signed up, it's very hard to get out, just like a cult.
Yeah, no, that's true. One thing I write about too is the kind of the misconstruing of shame in our culture, and it's a little bit similar to what you're saying, where people have an incentive to either show a great degree amount of shame to the mob because the mob demands all. And so even for the slightest of slights or the slightest of misdeeds, you will bow down to the mob. It's the only way, right? There's plenty of examples of that. On the other end of the spectrum, you give no apology whatsoever. And so you have a result of two extremes of, I guess, public figures who either never apologize and never say they did anything wrong, or they say they did everything wrong. And we fail to have the more nuanced conversation in the middle where, I don't know, maybe I kind of misspoke, but I didn't really mean it. And I didn't mean it, so leave me alone. Which is, say more, the Ellen DeGeneres take, right? And I use that as a good example of what to do, right? She gets canceled by the mob for daring to hang out with George W. Bush at a football game, and she doesn't apologize. She explains, says, "I don't have to apologize, but I will explain." And and we have so few of those moments, and they're useful, they're good, they work when it happens. But I don't understand why more people don't do it. Because the shaming culture, cancel culture, shaming culture, shame is a part of, obviously, the cancel culture. It's it ruins both the way we shame and the way we respond to shame.
Yeah, I agree. And shame is a very potent force. And so we ought to be treating it very carefully. And what has happened here is that it is being weaponized. And so this causes two things, and you've pointed them out here. One is that people will bend over backwards to explain how awful they are. They will do this out of fear, or they will deaden and they won't accept any responsibility. And so I'm very troubled by, this nominally left movement's insistence that people apologize for things that, frankly, in general, don't warrant an apology. Right? We're told that intent doesn't matter, which is obvious nonsense, for example. But on the other side, I hear never apologize. And never apologize isn't any good either. The answer is apologize only when it is warranted and only for that which it is warranted.
Right.
And, your point about explaining those things that need explaining and limiting apology to those things that are actually wrong, it actually does work. But I have the sense people have perhaps lost this skill, and they see it as all or nothing.
As an evolutionary biologist, can you point to some of the science or psychology and the impulses that it might create, or the impulses that people have to participate in kind of mob activities in cancel culture?
Yeah, there are a couple things to say. First of all, apology is an adaptation. That is to say, both the ability to offer one and the ability to accept it as meaningful is a bit surprising. And when one thinks about it carefully, this is actually the first assignment I ever gave as a professor, was I had my students try to explain why an apology works. Why is it that if somebody has harmed you, that them saying words does anything to placate you? And the answer is that it suggests an awareness of a debt.
Mm-hmm.
And so in knowing that, if somebody has harmed me and they don't acknowledge it, then I simply have the cost. If they have acknowledged that they harmed me and they've explained to me what they did wrong in their own words so that I know that they understand it, then not only is there an implication that that they owe me for the harm that they have done, but there is also the ability, if they do it again, to say, you knew this was wrong, right? So it changes things going forward. So it's a very potent force. But because it's a potent force, it is easy to co-opt it. And it's co-opted in the context where our natural impulse to treat it seriously and as a thing of value causes us to turn against ourselves. If you are told that you have deep racism, that it has resulted in you harming people, making them feel unsafe, the natural impulse is to think, oh my God, did I do that? And if so, wow, am I sorry? And even if you don't spot that it's correct, maybe the thought is, well, geez, it's incumbent on me to figure out how it is that I hurt people that I had no intent to hurt. Am I that callous? So those natural impulses to self-reflection and to treat other people well can be turned into a weapon very easily if somebody is attempting to gain power by convincing you to hobble yourself. And unfortunately, it means that the movement is functioning essentially culturally contagiously, right? It is spreading across the landscape. And the more people who start espousing these belief systems, the harder it is for people to realize, wait a minute, that doesn't even add up.
Right. And part of that apology also involves encouraging others to make the same apology. So it's like this chain reaction, because it makes you feel better if you're also getting others to do it. That's sort of like the anti-racist philosophy. But in reality, what happens, and I'm just actually going to quote you because it's the perfect quote for this. People are essentially solving personal problems by embracing ideology, which causes the mob to temporarily leave you alone, but empowers the mob to go after the next person, which is exactly right. And that's exactly the pattern that we see. And this kind of leads to, this revolution. And you call it a horizontal revolution taking place in the U.S., I suppose, as opposed to a vertical revolution. And I think I know what you mean by that, but I'll maybe ask you. And you say mainly because critical theory adopted by millennials who now believe they're demographically empowered. And so you've mentioned critical theory a couple of times. Maybe we should define that real quick. And also, what do you mean by horizontal revolution? Is it really that bad? I agree with you, by the way. It is that bad, and it's exactly what they're after.
So critical theory, I believe, has an honorable origin. It started as an investigation of systemic biases in our courts against some races and for others. And, the truth is that the patterns are actually quite shocking. So that discovery, however, gave rise to a set of disciplines that survey the entire landscape of civilization looking for biases. And they've done a terrible job of identifying biases, of figuring out what methodology to use to establish whether something that is imagined to be biased really is. And they've given rise to a number of different sub-disciplines. So queer theory, critical race theory, women's studies, all of these basically oppression-based disciplines are searching the landscape for grievances. And the problem is if you want to identify whether or not there has been an injustice, you need a methodology capable of identifying when the appearance of injustice doesn't indicate that there actually is one. In other words, it's perfectly possible to give somebody a lascivious look. It's also possible for somebody to imagine that you've given them a lascivious look when you haven't.
Right.
And so there has to be some mechanism for testing whether or not the perception of a harm reflects an actual reality.
Or whether a disparity even means a discrimination.
Right. Whether the disparity is real and whether it arises from any sort of biased process. So, for example, I used to use the example that cycling is racially non-representative, that black cyclists are disproportionately rare in casual cycling circles. I can't speak to competitive cycling, though I suspect it's similar. But in casual circles, you will see fewer black cyclists than you would expect based on their percentage of the population. But we can be pretty darn certain that that's not because there's anything about bike lanes or trails that discriminates against black cyclists. And I can tell you, having been in bike culture for my entire adult life, that there is nothing inside of bicycle shops or bicycle clubs that is anti-black. In fact, the opposite would probably be true, that because it's a white sport and the people who inhabit it are very frequently liberals, there would be a desire to bring blacks in when it was possible. And so to the extent that there's a disparity, it owes to something else. My guess would be it owes to something like access to safe, fun places to cycle, which has resulted in cycling being less prominent in black communities, not because anybody doesn't want blacks involved, but because maybe it may in fact owe to some past racism. In other words, the economic disadvantages that result in you living in some place where cycling is not as appealing may ultimately be rooted in some historical bias, but it's not modern racism among modern people, and therefore you would want to sort this out very carefully. But instead of doing that, there is the assumption that if there is a gap in a racial gap in the prevalence of a population inside something like cycling, that it must owe to modern racism. And I kid you not, I just ran across this article that alleged that in Oregon there was bias in our state parks that accounted for the lower numbers of black users of trails, and it attempted to argue that blacks were not present because of the looks that they were getting from whites on the trail, which is a nonsense explanation. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's preposterous. So we have gotten to a place as a result of these critical theory disciplines and their lack of a methodology where every discrepancy is going to be presumed to arise from some sort of bias somewhere in modern people's minds that amounts to bigotry and discrimination, which just simply isn't the case.
And that's it's kind of what this is all about. This is why it's so difficult to contend with these movements, because I don't know what you want me to do. And that's a problem. Generally, whether it's a protest or a movement, there's usually an end goal in mind. We want this changed. We want this person out of office. We want something. And then ostensibly you stop rioting or protesting after that because there's a goal in mind. But I see no such goal except total revolution. And I see nothing on the other side of that revolution. And, I have issues with people kneeling for the flag, and some will say it's a different sign of respect. I don't buy that just based on the rhetoric that's been used. But my question is always, at what point will you stand for it? Like what needs to change? What can we fight together? What is the systemic issue that we can fight together so that we can solve it? And if you can't identify that for me, I feel lost here.
Yeah, I agree with you completely about this. I have said that I am a liberal and a progressive because I believe we have to have change if we are to survive. But I want to live in a system so good that I can afford to be a conservative. And we should all actually want this. We should want a system in which we would be fools to change it. And so I think that's reflective of exactly what you're saying. What would have to be true for you to stand for the flag along with the rest of us? Yeah, and that's a valid question.
And critical theory basically doesn't allow for that, because everything is attributable to sort of this vague sense of injustice, and they keep it intentionally vague, right? It's like these looks, and it's like, I can't fight that. You know what I mean? And we can all march and shame people constantly about their looks, and the potential looks that they might give. And I'm sure it's true. I'm sure everybody's. I don't want to discount experiences that people have had. But you're also asking me to fight a ghost. Like I can't do something concrete about that, and that's a very frustrating place to be, especially as a policymaker.
This is all by design. And if you look into some of the claims, you can see it just on a simple inspection. So, for example, we are told that all white people have white supremacy in them, that the racism is inherent. It is therefore safe to assume it's incurable, because if it wasn't incurable, we'd have to ask, well, who has it and who doesn't? And the movement clearly tells us that all white people have it. But the movement also tells us that it must be addressed, which is preposterous. If it can't be cured, then what is this obsession with these trainings? So the movement wants it both ways, but that isn't a logical failure. It is, as you point out, the key to making these changes perpetual. What is really being sought here is power over everything. It's power in every interaction, every day of every week, forever. And the good news is that's not stable. It won't last. The bad news is that it does threaten everything along the way, and we will end up uninventing America in order to establish that actually this is just one more utopian belief system that cannot be brought into the world. It just simply will not last.
Well, it can. It looks a lot like Chaz, and it doesn't last, as it turns out. I wish more sociologists and other scientists had been allowed into Chaz just to study it. I bet a lot of really interesting information could have been garnered from that. One thing you say, revolutionaries, quote, fail to understand the instability that exists in evolutionary biology, which teaches us that socialism, quote, will not work because we are all wired differently, and anyone who opts out will outperform anyone who opts in. That's a really interesting analysis. I'm wondering if you can expand on that as we sort of lead into your other source of expertise, which is evolutionary biology.
Sure. If you think about what communism demands, the central claim is that we should structure the system so that resources are distributed, each according to their ability is how they will be generated, and each according to their need is how they will be spent. And it's kind of a beautiful idea. The problem with it is that if you set up that system, then anybody who creates need and fails to produce wins at the expense of those who produce and limit their needs.
Right.
So the part of us that is built by evolution, which is to say our central driver, is built to detect opportunities to profit. That's what we do. And so people discover that they can profit in such a system by freeloading. The system then reacts by restructuring their incentives, essentially by threatening them and reducing their freedom in order that they have no choice but to produce at the maximum level and consume at the minimum level. And so, in effect, it descends automatically into an authoritarian nightmare if it doesn't evolve into something that doesn't fit the label of communism. Those are the two choices. So, in effect, we can just simply say that the fact that the idea of everybody throwing in their effort and taking only what they need, that idea may be beautiful to us. And in fact, there are systems that work like this, like the human body, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Your heart and your liver don't fight over resources because they both agree that the ideal distribution of resources serves the organism. The reason they agree is because they have the same genes and people don't. So for people, you can't build a system that works like the body. You have to build it on some other basis. And we just simply ought to recognize that rather than continuing to reinvent the misunderstanding and then putting people in jeopardy in order to test it one more time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a premise that they're relying upon, that communists and socialists rely upon, a premise that human nature can be changed to fit this world. And I'm going to say what you said in a bit more layman's terms. It basically assumes that there's a bunch of hyper-productive individuals that will just continuing to produce in this hyper-productive manner for everybody else, even though they're not rewarded in kind, and even though they can see that others freeload off of that. And I think there's this sort of socialist belief that you can get people to do that and that it'll be okay and it'll work. And I don't see that as possible. I don't see human nature changing to that extent. And you're an evolutionary biologist. I mean, what do you say about human nature?
Well, human nature subscribes to a set of laws above it. So we know human nature will not change to do that because we understand that those who opt out of the change will outperform those who opt in. I wish it were more complex than that, but it's not. Now, that said, we have a different failure in our system, which is that opportunity ends up being hoarded by individuals who find themselves in a position to do it. And what that means is that the instinct which our system should amplify, which is if you produce things, you are rewarded for it, and therefore we should be driven to produce. There are lots of people who don't have a great opportunity to produce. And partly the energy behind the movement we see in our streets is that there is a lack of opportunity despite a system that creates a tremendous surplus. So there's frustration at the lack of opportunity, and frankly, you've got a whole generation who's been miseducated and is being parasitized, doesn't have prospects to buy a home, to raise a family, to have a career, and it should not surprise us that they're angry. So, yes, communism will be a failure each and every time, but we should recognize that although our system does not have to fail, that it is failing in a way that is now putting it in jeopardy, that is causing communism to rise in our streets, even though we should know better.
Yeah, and this is the more interesting and honest conversation between liberals and conservatives. What do you do? Sometimes I put it like this: the left and the right is fundamentally about chaos versus order, and not to say that chaos is a bad thing. It's kind of a necessary thing to make any sort of change. And order and maintaining a specific and traditional order all the time can't be good either. And so there's maybe a healthy debate there between change and tradition. I think the problem with our current debate is that the chaos part of that wants to completely undermine all of the traditions and all of the foundations that created wealth and prosperity in the first place. And, it's simply gotten too extreme. But there's a healthy conversation to be had here. Maybe we can, disagree on the solutions, or I don't know, maybe we agree on the solutions. I think liberals and conservatives tend to disagree on the extent of the problem. So do millennials have it harder than their parents? Interesting question. Some would say yes, some would say no. I think millennials clearly, I am a millennial. Housing, is it more expensive? Yes. Are university tuitions more expensive relative to our parents? Yes, I believe they are. Healthcare, even relatively speaking, yeah, I believe it is. So there's real complaints to be had here. Is there less opportunity? I don't know if that's as clear to me. Kind of depends on the major you chose. It depends. Also, did our parents strive to live in cool downtown areas? I don't think they did necessarily. So there's other questions that I always have in trying to ascertain the actual problem to the extent of the problem. And I think one thing the left likes to do is highly exaggerate the extent of the problem in order to justify their very radical solutions, which always, and there's an incentive to do that. And this is, and again, I'm maybe searching for some disagreement here, so we don't just agree this whole time. This is one thing that I point to even moderate liberals. I say even moderate liberals who I can have respectful disagreements with. It eventually leads to the more radical socialism because of this fact. You always have to outpromise your last promise. That's sort of the nature of well-intentioned progressivism. And it eventually gets us to this point, and you increasingly have to use more radical rhetoric to get voters there and to convince them that they're oppressed. So while it's well intentioned at first, it can lead to kind of more of a victimhood ideology and more of a socialist ideology, and we have to be more careful about making sure it doesn't, because there's a real and healthy conversation to be had there.
Well, I mean, I think you and I agree and disagree. As we started out here, we both agree that there's something to the tension between the things that liberals see clearly and conservatives tend not to, and vice versa, that basically you need people who have each of these reciprocal blind spots pulling in their direction so that we can find the sweet spot. As for whether or not liberalism actually has this bias towards grievance, I don't think it has to. And I think really you've got two kinds of liberalism. And for a millennial like you, I think you probably haven't seen this old school intellectual tradition on the left because it's become rare, but that this is the honorable version. And it has resulted in a tremendous amount of good for the nation and the world. And, the irony that conservatives are now defending the gains of liberals, that's how it should be, right? We should be producing a system that works better. And once we do, we should become very skeptical of attempts to change it, rather than the situation we have now, where as we do achieve some kind of equality for some previously unequal group, there is an urge to reinvigorate the complaint about the oppression, and therefore a search for ever smaller instances of it. That's a very unhealthy instinct. Yeah. But I really don't see it as fundamental to the left. I see it as the naive left having overwhelmed the intelligent left.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe we agree. I really disagree with anything you just said. Let's talk about the hoarding, though, because so I think this is a fundamental question. I don't know that conservatives disagree with this all that much. I mean, we look at corporate cronyism, not something we like. I think we attribute different causes for the hoarding of opportunity, and perhaps certainly different solutions as well. I just always wonder. Well, so what do you mean by that when you say hoarding of opportunity? And then maybe we can go from there.
Well, let me give you an example. And maybe before I give you an example, let me just say, I'm not necessarily talking about a conscious attempt to hoard opportunity. I'm talking about an evolutionary tendency for those with power to create policy that protects their position and beyond that amplifies the disparity. So schools, for example, nobody ever says, you know what, I want public schools to be terrible because I'm going to send my kid to private school and I don't want other people's children competing successfully with my children. Right. So in an effort to prevent that from happening, I'm going to sabotage the schools that other people's children go to. Nobody says that. And what's more, I don't think almost anybody thinks it. On the other hand, we have a persistent failure to fix schools in this country that has many mysterious features. We simply don't pay teachers enough to attract good people in large numbers to the profession. And I can tell you, as an educator, having cruddy people at the head of the classroom is a terrible error, right? It hobbles us nationally. We would be much better off to pay enough that people who really knew something deep and were passionate would be teachers, maybe not even permanently. Maybe they would be teachers for 5 years or 10 years and they'd move on to something else. But we should be paying enough that very high quality people are joining the profession and enhancing the capacity of future generations. What we have now is a system where we do have the occasional very passionate teacher attracted to the system, but then we hobble them with an absurd set of rules that makes it impossible for them to do what it is that they're passionate about. And the whole thing results in a situation in which school barely functions. Not only does it not create very high quality minds, but it actually behaves in an arbitrary fashion and takes many people who would be capable, and in my opinion, makes them less creative and less able. So that's a remarkable failure for us to have, and the damage to the nation done by this failure is clear too. It's not like this is in our national interest. It's clearly against it.
Right.
Yet, we can't seem to agree. Let's start with a fresh sheet of paper. Let's dedicate enough monetary resource in order to solve the problem, and let's make really good schools, right? How is it that we're failing to do that? And my point would be, it has to do with people rationalizing attacks on those things that would work in order to preserve the opportunity that their children will have with reduced competition.
Are you a fan of charter school model and school choice in general as a way to solve that?
Well, let's put it this way. As a young person, I would have been dead set against it because I saw it as an attack on the public schools. And I think there's a lot of truth to the fact that it was, in some sense, a cryptic attack on the public schools. That said, I'm not sure that you couldn't build a good system with that. And I've seen, in a number of cases, I've seen things that I believe started out as predatory actually evolve into viable solutions. So I'm open to anything that works. And I'm frustrated enough at the nature of school as we find it that I think the solution will have to be, it's not going to be an infusion of cash into public schools. That won't work. It's going to have to be something that looks like a rethink. And, could that start on a charter model? If you tell me that everybody is going to have enough to get a good education and that they will have a lot of choice about what good education means, I'm all ears.
Yeah. And, you're not going to get a lot of pushback from conservatives on paying teachers more. We just did it in Texas, where Republicans control all, the Senate, the state house, and the governorship. The thing is, if you're going to raise wages, and again, I think we should, then we also have to lessen the stranglehold that the unions have on this profession, and allow bad teachers to be fired. Just like, because one of the most demoralizing things for anybody, whether it's teaching or anything else, is when you see people who totally underperform and are bad at their job, stay on the job, while you outperform and do the right thing.
Yeah, it's a disaster. And I would say it's half of a puzzle, though, because I read something some years ago which resonated for me as a professor, which basically said, unfortunately, you can't really teach someone how to teach well. That the data apparently suggest that people either have a knack for figuring out what other people are hearing and for innovating ways of conveying material to them, or they don't. And if you take a bad teacher, there's no amount of teacher education that fixes the problem. So yes, we have to be able to get rid of bad teachers. We also have to be able to attract people for whom it ought to be their calling.
Yeah.
And if you do both those things, if you attract really good people and you get rid of the bad people, we could have glorious schools. And we're foolish not to, because, well, at some level in the streets today, you're seeing the result of bad schooling. People who apparently cannot figure out that what they're saying is illogical and dangerous are on the march and utterly convinced that they are on the right side of history.
Yeah, there's like a lack of teaching of how to think, of logic-based thinking. The people on these radical movements would say that what they're saying is logical, but they engage in logical fallacies constantly, and I think they utterly believe them. I can never tell. I deal with it with my colleagues too. I wonder, are you trying to be clever, but what you're saying isn't true, or are you truly engaging in a logical fallacy and don't know it? I whether it's a false comparison or whatever it is, I just don't know. And are we not teaching it, or are we deliberately looking past it I'm not sure which one it is.
It's some of both. And then there's a third thing, which is when you have fear as such a potent ingredient of a movement, you have people saying things that they don't know are false, saying some things that they do know are false, but then they rationalize themselves into believing that they actually think it's true in order not to have to explain to themselves why they lied.
Yeah.
Because nobody wants to feel like they lied because they were afraid. That's not a position people enjoy. So they will convince themselves that they spoke the truth, and that rationalization is among the more dangerous patterns we're seeing.
Yeah. Anyway, I was pushing on the hoarding of opportunity thing again, searching for some disagreement. We haven't really found it because I don't really disagree with your take on schools either. I mean, there's clearly sort of zones of opportunity that just build more opportunity. The question is, how do we? I'm not, as a conservative, I am not concerned about inequality. It doesn't bother me that somebody's bazillion times richer than me. It doesn't bother me that I get no money for my podcast and Joe Rogan gets $100 million a year. It doesn't bother me as long as I feel like I have a way that I can be rewarded for the talents that I do have. And, some people maybe don't feel that way. Some people maybe don't feel like they do have that path upward. Maybe it's through an apprenticeship or that first job or whatever it is. Maybe they don't even live in a safe community where they've got to stay alive, let alone figure out how to learn a skill. So I get that. I guess what I'm saying is my concern is how do you get out of poverty, not so much how you reduce inequality, but mostly because when I hear the left's priorities being injustice and inequality, I think I'm being very fair to them because that's what they say all the time. I'm like, fine, but what's the measurement of inequality that you're going to be finally okay with? And you're like, okay, we got it, we solved it. Again, there's no standard, so I don't know. So I feel like it's a perpetual battle on purpose, so I think it's better to focus on the sources of success and how you make sure you provide those sources to these zones of our culture and our communities that just simply have less opportunity.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that either. But I actually think maybe, I hear you honorably searching for zones of disagreement. And I think there's a lesson in the difficulty in finding them, which is that at some level, we've actually reached a point at which all the people who are paying attention, who think carefully, all the smart kids are seeing the same picture. The crazy thing is that picture does not have political power. In other words, the irony of this moment is that we are about to tear apart a system that has all the underlying structure necessary to make it excellent, to solve all of the problems that the left claims it wants to solve without doing the harm that the right fears it would do. And yet, we can't get to the picture that we know is right, because at the moment we're having a mind-numbing battle between Democrats and Republicans, and between the street that insists that everything is racist from one end to the other and has to be leveled in order to build anything that could possibly work. Why is it that if you and I'm a radical, you're a conservative Republican, if we see the same picture, why is that picture not on everybody's mind?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, this is maybe a good segue to get to what you want to talk about. You've written about this Unity 2020. So I want to hear real quick from you on Unity 2020, what you mean by that. And but then I also really want to ask you about some of the things we had talked about before about evolutionary biology, which has nothing to do with all this complex politics stuff.
Sure. So let me tell you about Unity 2020. So the Unity 2020 plan is based in the recognition that something has gone wrong with the major parties and the choices that it has delivered us. And in particular, the choice that it has delivered us in our presidential election this year is absolutely unacceptable. And frankly, I don't think we need to agree on the details to recognize that there's something so divisive and political about President Trump, and so dangerous about the style of leadership. And if you don't think it's dangerous, take a look at the response to the pandemic. that on the right we've got Trump. On the left we've got, or I don't even know that I would call it left, but we've got Biden, who not only is he a crony capitalist, but he is clearly in failing cognitive health. It would be insane for a country with nuclear weapons, with a position of power in the world that is unique, to have somebody who is losing his ability to think placed in a position of power. Neither of these is an acceptable way forward. Now, of course, we can never get out of the choice offered to us by the major parties, because we are each told by whichever major party is closer to our political viewpoint that if you consider anything outside of the choice that they have given us, you will rob votes from the party that is closer to your values, and you will empower the party that is farther, and therefore you will deliver us the greater evil. So Unity 2020 solves this question structurally. The plan is we draft two candidates, one from the left, one from the right, under the agreement that they will govern as a team with equal power. Only in circumstances where they can't reach agreement, which is a failure, would the president's perspective dominate, or in cases where there was no time to consult, like some sort of a military decision for which there's no time to reach a consensus. But in every other case, they would govern together, and after 4 years, their positions would reverse, their positions in the first case having been chosen by a coin flip. What this does is it disempowers both major parties and allows us to contemplate candidates who have three characteristics. The characteristics that candidates would have to be named for our ticket are: they would have to be courageous, they would have to be capable, and they would have to be patriots. So the question is, can we get enough of a groundswell around this idea to draft two candidates for this ticket that would run against the major party candidates? Now, people, of course, even though the thing structurally is built not to elect the greater evil, whoever you may think that is, people still fear that outcome. And so there's a fail-safe built in as well. If the election approaches and the ticket cannot win, we pull the plug on the plan, and the voters can return to their chosen corners.
It's interesting. I mean, it's idealistic. From my perspective, running for office, it's so impossible to run for office without having a base first of support who know what you think and understand it. And it's very hard for that base, and it's a sizable base. It's not a small number of people. It's impossible for them to I think support somebody who would have an active, who would have a partner who is actively against them on all policy levels. Now, I think it'd be more realistic, and if the parties weren't so far apart on so many policies. And I think over time, there's extremism is an interesting word and what it means as it relates to political parties. One way to measure extremism is the YouTube video that most people interested in politics has probably seen, and it shows some red and blue dots over time moving further and further apart. I don't think that quite measures extremism the way people think it does. What that is measuring is a particular seat in Congress, not a particular person, but a particular seat in Congress, and their voting record. So what it's measuring is compromise, and how compromise used to happen more, and now it happens a lot less, because it's. So another way, so we would have to take a more qualitative look at how policies have changed with each political party over time, and see how those have been driven apart. And I would argue that the left has changed their policies radically, and the right really hasn't. You can point to some nuanced changes here and there, but they haven't. I understand, how you feel about Trump. You've made that pretty clear. Some people say he's changed the party radically, but I don't. And you could argue that in terms of rhetoric and tone, I think, but not so much policy, as it turns out. And so I guess in our current status, though, of how different we are, it's hard for me to imagine it. I mean, I like but I'm not totally against the idea. Is it different from a third party effort? How would you see that?
Yeah, it's very different from a third party in that it's non-ideological, it's apolitical. But I would point out, this conversation actually does a pretty good job of establishing the central premise, which is if you take somebody from the left and the right, are you going to get deadlock because they just simply won't be able to agree on anything? And my sense is no. Courageous, capable patriots from the left and the right will overwhelmingly see the same picture of what is desirable for the country. They will likely disagree on the degree to which things are functional at the moment, as they naturally should. That's built into the biases of these perspectives. But I believe they would overwhelmingly see a clear path forward. I expect actually that part of the plan would work perfectly. Can people imagine their way to it? I don't know. But I do think people need to open their eyes and they need to look at the danger that they're being placed in by the major parties. And, you said that I've made it pretty clear how much I dislike Trump. I think you're actually hearing something in what I'm saying that isn't there. I think Trump must be removed from office because I think his style of leadership is an existential threat. That said, he accomplished the impossible. He effectively defeated one of the major parties in order to become president. That is a major accomplishment. My sense of the tragedy of Trump and the hazard of Trump is that the same property that allowed him to do that, his deep insight into politics and how it functions and how to play that game, characterizes his perspective. And my sense of what he has done in office is that he has viewed every issue through that lens. And we just can't afford it. The fact is, it's not a view that puts America first. It's a view that puts winning within a political context first. And COVID is an excellent demonstration of the hazard of that.
Yeah, maybe that's where our disagreement, we could finally find one, is because before COVID, it was I think it was pretty hard to make that argument that America wasn't doing well and better. Could it always be improved? Of course, absolutely. There is a narrative out there that the federal government just completely and utterly failed on the COVID response, and I've spent a lot of time, sort of debunking this. Because I'm with it all the time. I see the actions taken. I see the accusations leveled by the left and by the media against the federal government. I see somebody like Biden say, "This is what I would do if I were in charge," but what he's really doing is just repeating exactly what's already been done every single time. I mean, it's without fail. And so I find it to be a bit overblown. I'm also, I am also, just generally speaking, my general temperament is I think we should have a degree of humility about what we can and can't control. And in the case of a pandemic, and especially as we're seeing cases rise across the world, as ebbing and flowing, it appears obvious to me that severe lockdowns simply delayed the virus. You can never really stop it, and that our best bet was simply managing through that. I think I remember your stance on the COVID response would have been basically like a much stronger lockdown for a shorter period of time to just completely eradicate it. I just wonder how possible that really is, just given the nature of our society, or any society for that matter.
Well, that's half of what we needed to do, in my opinion. Yeah. We needed to really lock down for something like 6 weeks, and then that would not fully control it. It would mostly control it. And then what we would need to do is have excellent testing and tracing to deal with the flare-ups that would occur afterwards. And I believe that this actually is possible. And what's more, as an evolutionist, I'm concerned that we have not understood the full horror of COVID. So if that sounds draconian, it's because I have fears about what COVID could become that would make such a thing worthwhile. Now, mind you, I think now that everybody's been through this, if you could go back in time and you could spend 6 weeks in a much more intense lockdown, but have been effectively done with it at that point, I think the wisdom of that perspective should now be evident. Now, of course, that's contingent on the fact that what I'm suggesting would actually have functioned, but I believe the evidence suggests it was possible to do that, and in retrospect, it would have been wise.
Yeah, maybe that's where we disagree. I don't know that that's ever possible. Just the fact that we have, essential employees who work the basic things like a power plant. Like how would people get food for 6 weeks? Like, for instance, there's a lot of logistical problems that I think occur that require much more face-to-face interaction than we would have liked in order to achieve that goal. And again, I think places that did do it. So New Zealand's a little different because it's a tiny little island. They have this ability to sort of truly lock themselves down. But I think it's spreading in New Zealand is probably inevitable at some point because you just can't do this forever. And we live in this sort of global economy. And so I don't know.
I hear what you're saying, but for one thing, we could have taken advantage of summer in a way that we haven't. Yeah. So to the extent that interactions need to happen in the Northern Hemisphere, with it being summer, we have the opportunity to take lots of things that we do indoors and take them outdoors, where the transmission rate, at least during the day, is essentially zero. So I am not arguing for a lockdown for its own sake. In fact, Heather being my wife, and I have been advocating for months to loosen restrictions where we know the virus doesn't spread and tighten them where we know that it does. Because at some level, we're all now suffering from lockdown fatigue, where we just see these restrictions as onerous and we're all bridling against them. So what we should be doing is borrowing from the things that are actually safe in order to spend where we need to be more careful. And we're not doing a good job of this. And frankly, summer is drawing to a close. So we're going to lose that opportunity because interaction is going to be driven indoors for reasons of climate.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think we've sort of gotten to the point. It depends on the state, of course. Again, I'm very much. I think universal lockdowns add a lot of costs without providing the benefit that they're purported to provide. I think more targeted approaches, which is sort of what we've come to do in most states, like in Texas, where you lock down bars because it seems pretty obvious that it can spread very well in bars. You lock down mass gatherings, right? No big events. That seems pretty obvious too. But it also seems like we can operate just fine in a restaurant if you take certain precautions. And so it's following the science. What drives me crazy about the listen to the science crowd is they pick and choose their. I mean, it's nonsense. It's
boy, do they!
And I'm like, is there some formula that I'm missing that tells us exactly what policy prescription to follow? Because last time I checked, science is. One, a lot of scientists disagree. I can find you scientists who are full on lockdown enthusiasts, and I can find you others who think it's nonsense to the nth degree. The school thing, there seems to be a pretty big consensus on amongst the scientists that we should have in-person learning with precautions. But yeah, the listen to the science crowd, it's like it's such a misinterpretation of science at all, like as if there's somebody named science who will just tell us the perfect thing to do. And no, it's up to policymakers to weigh costs and benefits. And these are difficult decisions. And it seems that nobody wanted to make difficult decisions. So they took the most extreme option of universal lockdowns for a very extended period of time. And as you would argue, we didn't even do it well.
Yeah, we did it well enough to suffer without doing it well enough to actually control the virus.
Which I think is inevitable, and that's where we disagree. I think it was inevitable that we didn't do it well because that's the nature of our society as a human race.
And American society too. Our individualism worked against us in this case. I think we know that, and we should recognize that it's not. The individualism has strong benefits. In this case, it cost us. If there was a way to suspend it for a brief period of time, that would have been valuable. But, I think we have to take the whole thing in context. To your point about, the do what science says crowd, it's very hard to take that perspective seriously when scientists have been so quick to dismiss any suggestion that this virus might have emerged from the laboratory, which, if you have looked into it, is actually a very likely possibility. And so let's put it this way. I am a strong believer that we should have science that is so far above politics and markets that we can afford to listen to the best assessment of scientists, which won't always be right. But nonetheless, it has to be immunized from these other considerations. And instead, what we have is a politicized science that highlights certain things and downplays other things and has made itself untrustworthy, which is extremely dangerous.
Yeah, and you could probably apply that to a lot of issues where politics gets involved and science gets used as this sort of either scapegoat or some other tool to further an ideology. Speaking of science, I didn't get to ask you about what I really wanted to get into. We might have to save it for another episode, unfortunately. I am being ushered into to my next thing. But maybe another episode, maybe you'll agree to that, on evolutionary biology and how that relates to interesting existential questions like intelligent design, a belief in God, what science describes, stem cells. I want to ask you about telomeres and cell division as it relates to age and cancer. There was some interesting conversations you had with Joe Rogan. So maybe another time, because you've got a lot of really cool things to talk about.
Great. Well, that sounds like a fun conversation. I would be excited to have it.
I would too. We'll definitely schedule that. So, Dr. Bret Weinstein, thank you so much for being on with this fascinating discussion on cancel culture, universities, politics, Unity 2020, all of it. Really, really incredible to have you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. I really enjoyed it.